Welcome to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and we're thrilled to have you joining us from wherever you're from in the data center, digital infrastructure, critical facilities ecosystem, regardless of whether you're part of a data center operator like a colocation, edge, hyperscale, wholesale, modular data center, colocation kind of provider, or perhaps you do something related to data center technology or data center facilities, or maybe you in construction or real estate or the investment side of digital infrastructure, or perhaps you work in and around outsourced sales and marketing in and around the data center ecosystem. Regardless of where you're located or what part of the data center ecosystem you contribute to, we're thrilled to have you joining us this week. And we welcome people from all different kinds of roles that are directly or indirectly related to go-to-market teams. Maybe you work in some facet of marketing, either as a generalist or digital or content or event marketing, field marketing, social media marketing, demand generation, product marketing. Perhaps you work in product management or channel partnerships or customer success or account management or some other facet of sales, like being an account executive or sales development or business development. Or perhaps you are the executive leader, the executive sponsor, whose job it is to go out and recruit talented, amazing people to join your team and get them working in the right places on the team, rowing the boat at the right speed, at just the right time, playing their musical instruments at the right tempo, at the right volume to make this symphony of data center growth happen, to propel your company, your team, and your individuals together to amazing new heights of greatness. If this is the first time you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, we're thrilled to have you with us. If you're a frequent visitor, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us as well. And let us know in the comments, wherever you're watching, what do you do in the data center industry? We'd love to know. So what is on the agenda for this week's show? We're going to first start by talking about how colocation, cloud, and managed hosting providers can reduce their cost of ownership and improve efficiency. After that, we will look at how a data center infrastructure management company markets and sells to data center clients. Next, we'll turn our attention to how a data center infrastructure and facility management company finds the right leads. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about commissioning, and in particular, how a data center commissioning company can avoid commoditization from pre-design, design, construction, and turnover competition. How a data center commissioning company can avoid pre-design, design, construction, and turnover related commoditization. After that, we'll get into how a global data center solutions provider can improve their lead generation. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's show, we'll talk about how to create a memorable hyperscale data center brand in a saturated market. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments section wherever you like to watch. And if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can sign up, you can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question. How does a colocation, cloud, and managed hosting provider reduce its total cost of ownership and improve its efficiency? How does a company that's primarily in the business of providing colocation data center space, cloud services, and managed hosting reduce its cost of ownership and improve efficiency? So it's a interesting multi-pronged question there. We're going to first simplify things by recognizing that it's very likely that your company is able to provide colocation, cloud, and managed hosting to most or all of your clients. In other words, it's not like this is three separate divisions of your company. It's not like it's three entirely separate brands or three different client bases. I'm going to go out on a limb here and hope that your company management team has integrated these parts of your company well enough together where it's the same marketers, the same business development, same account executives, same account managers that are responsible for generating demand, generating new opportunities, closing those new opportunities, onboarding, retaining, expanding all of these accounts, and then most of your clients are a good fit for needing most of those three categories of services: colo, cloud, and managed hosting. So given all of that, when it comes to reducing cost of ownership and improving efficiency, there's two ways to go with that. One is, if we're talking about this from the context of a technologist or a facilities manager, especially from a facilities manager perspective, when it comes to efficiency, of course, you're going to look at your PUE rating, your PUE rating. And there's a lot of controversy in the last year or two about whether that still is a fully accurate reading of the total efficiency of your data center, or whether it's a dated metric. I've had at least a handful of brilliant guests on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast that are much deeper subject matter experts about all things related to data center engineering and power and cooling and measuring efficiency, that have serious, very well thought out issues with whether the conventional benchmark that's used globally is really still well suited to measure the actual efficiency of a data center facility. And that challenge to believing in that benchmark number that's been around for decades seems to be getting even more further away from tradition of how it's been measured as we accelerate more into high density workloads and liquid cooling and 600 kilowatt racks, right? All of these things that we know are coming in the future because of AI and NVIDIA GPUs and high performance computing and supercomputing. So with all of that in mind, I am going to look at this from the standpoint of ownership and efficiency at a more macro level, at a more GTM level. Obviously, from a ownership level and go-to-market efficiency and overall financial efficiency of the firm and capital efficiency of the firm, one of the unmistakable trends that has been accelerating, it was really picking up steam in the 2010s, but it's really accelerated even more in the last couple of years, is the idea of mergers and acquisitions, consolidating a lot of co-location, small to mid-sized co-location operators together, and becoming a really important roadmap for charting the future for a lot of these companies. In fact, I often talk with small co-location operators approach me in the 2020s. It's funny, most of the small 1, 2, 3 location kind of co-location operators that I work with in the 2010s, nearly all of their owners have exited those businesses now. In other words, they sold to a larger company, or they merged together with another company that's now a much larger entity. And there's a couple of reasons behind this, purely from the standpoint of having resources to go after much more ambitious projects. Building data centers is crazy capital intensive. It used to be very capital intensive. In recent years, it's gotten even more off the rails. So there's that part of that, starting with site selection and lobbying and multi-years and accelerating and figuring out where there's utility hookups and everything like that. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, for marketers and sales professionals and account managers, if you were just 1 or 2 locations for your co-location facility, either with facilities you owned or because you didn't have a lot of agreements with other colo providers where you're renting space in their facilities, you really put an upper limit on the sophistication level of the clients that you can work with. Because once you get to a certain company size and a certain level of experience, I guess, of the CTO, of the IT director, they're going to need you to have multiple locations, if for no other reason than business continuity and disaster recovery. But when you start to look at like latency sensitive applications and governance related issues, the one or two location, 2, 3, 4 location co-location operator that may have been a wildly successful business model 10 years ago, I think is on very, very borrowed time, unless it's renting spaces in a number of larger providers' facilities and kind of like white labeling that as part of its own location portfolio, especially as you get deeper into wanting to move up the value chain, wanting to move up into larger clients, wanting to improve your unit economics, providing managed services. All of that strongly argues for scaling up, being able to have more efficiency. So I think that's definitely part of the go-to-market efficiency part. Second is, in addition to the financial and the capital necessity of all this, marketing and selling is very different than it was 10 years ago as well. Not lost on the irony with all of this is that so much of the data center digital ecosystem, digital infrastructure ecosystem growth right now is being powered by AI expansion. And unless you have been on vacation for the last 3, 4, 5 years and disconnected from the internet, you, like most of your prospects and clients, are likely using generative AI apps. You may have your favorites. Maybe you're a fan of Copilot or ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity or Gemini. It doesn't matter. All that really matters is that these apps in many ways are replacing what people used to go to Google for. And because of that, a lot of traditional search engine marketing and search engine optimization, like Google ads, Bing ads kind of stuff, no longer has anywhere near the effectiveness in driving late stage, bottom of the funnel, high intent kind of searches like it used to. Coupled with the fact that 10 years ago, your prospects and clients would have likely spent about half of their research and decision-making process with a member of your sales team. Back in the 2010s, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now part of Gartner, did research with Salesforce and SiriusDecisions, and they found that 57% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact. So that wasn't too bad, right? If you did most things right, you still were in there for the final 43% of their research and decision-making process. However, those preferences are now very much a point of nostalgia, like BlackBerries and fax modems kind of nostalgia. We now live in a world where nearly all of the buyer's journey is over before you get to meet a prospect. Gartner puts that number at 83%. Meaning that even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the final 17% of the journey. And that really doesn't give you much time to be able to run a good exploratory consultative process, to really diagnose before you prescribe, to really understand what's going on in that client, to educate and build trust. So the challenge with all of this is self-service, self-driven buyer's journey that, of course, were accelerated by baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, 10 years of digital transformation, tens of millions of people working from home at the beginning of the 2020s. And even, the funny thing is, I'm on the young side of Gen X. All of the baby boomers that I know that still work full-time or part-time as advisors in the data center ecosystem, they're all digitally savvy at this point. They're on LinkedIn all day long. How do you know that? Because that's how they communicate. They're constantly sharing pictures and posts about what they're working on. They're constantly especially because of the stage and the wisdom that they have in their career. They're on podcasts all the time. They're on webinars all the time. And you see evidence of this because they're sharing on LinkedIn. So at this stage, we have reached a tipping point now where all of these preferences, especially among highly cynical, highly skeptical IT decision makers, engineering decision makers, facilities managers, decision makers, everyone is more sales allergic than they've ever been in the past. And because of that, getting in early and often is more challenging than it's ever been if you're commoditized, if you're struggling with differentiation. And the key unlock with all of this is we're seeing that the sales leaders, the account executives, account managers that are flourishing are ones that tend to be a little bit more technical than their peers. In other words, they look a lot more like the buyer personas that they're actually marketing and selling to than a traditional salesperson. In other words, they either come from an IT background, or they come from an engineering background, or they've just done a lot of great self-study in recent years to keep their skills super sharp. So much to the point that someone that's working for a company that's selling cloud and colo and hosting, it's very, very common for that kind of person to have a home computer lab where they tinker around with stuff and they're doing training and certifications on their own to level up. And in many ways, they have the skill set that they could almost be like a fractional CTO for small, medium-sized, small local mom and pop kind of businesses in their area, nights and weekends. And it used to be that kind of skill set was a nice to have. Now it's more of a must have. Otherwise, the IT professionals that you sell to, especially for colo cloud and managed hosting, they're not going to see any reason to want to spend much time with you because they can get better information self-service online. So this changes the nature of who will be on a sales team, on an account manager team going forward, like solution engineering team, sales engineering team going forward. This changes the nature of how companies need to invest a lot more aggressively in professional development, workforce redevelopment, upskilling, cross-training. And this isn't like a set it and forget it. This is like a continual commitment to continuing to level up and the accelerated pace of change. What's interesting is in the last couple of months as well, I've seen some mid-sized data center operators actually lay off their learning and development leader, which is really troubling because this is like the key person, the key internal champion who's responsible for making sure that everyone in the company has a well-defined path for upskilling and leveling up and keeping sharp with everything they need to do. I think part of it, as you see a lot more managers using self-driven tools and letting the professionals who want to keep their career track, be more the CEO of their own path, as opposed to someone having a much more structured plan in place. But I think this also varies depending on the financial health and the culture of the company, because for sure there are pockets, especially in the power management, facilities management, infrastructure kind of side, with large companies that still continue to invest very, very aggressively in internal training, internal skills development, internal certifications. Even, what's interesting is a lot of the same investments that a company needs to make to keep its internal team sharp are the exact same kind of investments that it needs to make for its channel partners. So in other words, if they're already developing great courses, great credentialing, great skills awareness, and of course, this is something that needs to be maintained. It's not like you're going to create this course and it's going to sit under museum glass untouched for 5 years. It needs to be maintained. But the same kind of approach that you would largely use to keep your sales team, to keep your marketers, to keep your account managers on a level playing fields and on the edge of what they need to do to be able to support your prospecting clients better, largely the same thing that you would want to do with your channel partners, regardless of whether you're talking about like MSPs, managed service providers, integrators, consultancies, master agents, VARs, value-added resellers. So like in terms of reducing ownership and efficiency, obviously there's a very different kind of conversation that you would have if you're speaking to one of your ideal clients, buyer personas, who's a technologist or a facilities manager or an engineer, or even like a small business owner, or it could be a secondary or tertiary stakeholder, like someone in finance or sustainability or compliance or something like that. I'm looking at this from the standpoint of go-to-market efficiency. I'm looking at this from the standpoint of owning a brand. That's another big consideration aside from like the unit economics and self-driven journey and the capital side of building and expanding a data center facilities footprint. The third part of all of this is what it means to have a brand. As I mentioned before, in the self-driven buyer's journey, where you really need to work harder than ever to get in early and get in often, and those 28 touch points that define how your prospects and clients see your category. The whole idea of what a brand is in the 2020s and beyond has radically changed. It used to be 10 years ago that when you thought about branding, it was primarily aesthetics and your hexadecimal colors, your fonts, your logos. It was something that was very centrally controlled by a creative director, someone who had like a PhD in Adobe Creative Suite. And agility speed definitely wasn't one of the primary factors. It was about having a very tightly defined brand, protective brand strategy. And there is a need for that to a certain degree as well. But in the world we now live in, your brand is no longer just the fonts. It's no longer just the colors. It's no longer just the logos. Your brand is everything that the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room. And given that you're really not in the room for the most of the buyer's journey anymore, it is incredibly important to try to figure out a way to get back into the room. Some people believe the way to get back into the room is to spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year, or your local currency equivalent, on putting on these big splashes at big national and global conferences. And if your ideal clients tend to have a really high match rate, if your ICP or ideal client profile has a really high match rate with the particular conference's demographics from last year's event and this year's event, well, there could be something to be said for that being part of brand exposure. I'd still caution you that you'd want to err on the side primarily of educating and building trust, meaning that there's extreme value in being a speaker and being the content for the event, but diminishing value in trying to compete for the 8 hours or 12 hours that the expo floor is actually open among 100 or 200 companies, just to maybe get 1 to 3 minutes of time with someone while they're passing by and half listening to you. There's a lot to be said for what it takes to build that brand and compete and win attention, where you have a chance to really shape the criteria. And yes, conferences can be part of that selectively. I think there's a lot of companies that are overdosing on their conference investments at the expense of building and protecting their own brand. I think a much more balanced approach is incredibly important if you care about efficiency, if you're caring about reducing the total cost of ownership for building and growing this kind of business, and especially where you have like a colo managed hosting kind of business where your buyer personas are likely heavily skewed towards having extreme geographic proximity near your facilities. It is so much more effective and so much more cost efficient for you to be running a lot of micro events in your own facilities with your perfect target account list buyer personas than it is to go spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions at big national and global conferences where only 50% or only 20% or whatever it is of those conference attendees match up to your ICP and are the right people even there. And if the right people are even there, are they in the right mindset? And when they're in the sessions, probably they're in the right mindset, as long as you have the right people in the sessions. When they're partying, when they're at the cabana party poolside, when they're playing golf, when they're enjoying happy hour and going around and collecting t-shirts for their kids, are they really in the mindset for education and trust building? I don't know. That's something you have to figure out for yourself. But building a brand in the 2020s and beyond for colo, cloud, and hosting for sure involves a lot of education and trust building. So when I think about big picture, kind of pulling this all together of how a co-location cloud and managed hosting provider can reduce its ownership and improve its efficiency, again, I would think of the inevitable amount of mergers and acquisitions that are happening, because it's so much more expensive to be in that kind of business, just purely from a real estate perspective, let alone from a technology and a facilities and sales and marketing, go-to-market efficiency kind of perspective. So we have the capital part of that ratcheting up, and a lot of this is being accelerated by AI and incredibly high density racks and having to potentially repurpose colo facilities into edge facilities because they can't handle the workloads that clients have anymore. That's a whole separate kind of Q&A. The second part of that is the self-driven buyer's journey, where a lot of your ideal clients, most of your ideal clients and prospects, your primary, secondary, tertiary buyer personas, really don't want to spend a ton of time talking to humans from your sales team anymore, unless they see those people as experts, unless they see those as people that can really help them a lot shape their biggest goals, not your biggest goals, but your buyer persona's biggest goals and your buyer persona's biggest struggles and challenges. To the extent that they can be resource people for that, many times they'll be welcomed in. To the extent that they're completely tone deaf and completely tuned out to your buyer persona's biggest goals and challenges, it's an uphill battle. So we have the financial constraints and capital requirements, kind of the first cousins there. We have the self-driven buyer's journey. And then the third part is, what does it mean to actually build a strong brand in colo, cloud, and managed hosting, so you can protect your pricing power, so you can truly be differentiated, so you can have a profitable, sustainable, profitable, healthy kind of business for reducing your total cost of ownership for that business, improving your go-to-market efficiency. So those are the three main considerations that I would take into account for how a co-location, cloud, and managed hosting provider can reduce its cost of ownership and improve its efficiency from a go-to-market, from a GTM perspective. Again, if you're having this question come up with a technologist, you're going to have different kinds of conversation points that are tailored and hopefully dialed into that individuals that buy our personas, goals, and challenges. If you're having that kind of conversation with someone on the facilities or engineering side, different kinds of goals and challenges. If you're having this conversation with a channel partner, like an MSP or an integrator or a VAR or someone like that, different goals and challenges. And that's the biggest message, the biggest takeaway from all of this is whenever you're answering a question like that is incredibly important to understand what journey stage that particular person is in, and most of all, who they are, who they are and what their context is, where they are in their relationship with your company. So that's how I would approach how a co-location cloud and managed hosting provider can reduce its cost of ownership and improve its go-to-market efficiency. So what is up next? By the way, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, be sure to hit the like button to help spread the word, share the love. What do we got here next? How does a data center infrastructure management company market and sell to data center clients? How does a data center infrastructure management company market and sell to data center clients? I think what it largely comes down to is first understanding your business model and understanding where you have product market fit, where you have go-to-market fit, where you potentially have channel partner market fit. And with that in mind, who are your best clients and who do you want more of? So for this, the person who asked this question, data center infrastructure management company, this could be a professional services firm who basically runs infrastructure for data centers, kind of like a channel partner, but a little different, providing more services to the data center side. Potentially, the interesting part with infrastructure is most of the time it means technology inside of a facility, but a lot of times outside there's infrastructure that comes up on the facility side as well. So you definitely want to dial in. Are you working with technologists? Are you working with facilities folks? Or are you working with both as an infrastructure management company? However, there's a whole category of software that's been around for decades, DCIM, data center infrastructure management software, that typically is, again, multi-pronged, serves multiple kinds of stakeholders within the data center. So when it comes to marketing and selling to data center clients, as long as your company has an established client base, what we're essentially looking to do is to find more clients like that. If you have a brand new startup, then you have a whole separate set of challenges as you build out your product and services roadmap, as you run iterations and experiments to see what messaging resonates, what product feature resonates, what price point resonates. Usually for entrepreneurs that have a brand new company like that, it's very unlikely that you went into this completely cold. Usually the founder of that kind of company or the co-founders from that kind of company usually worked for someone else doing something related to this before they went out on their own. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that your company is well past the stage that you've achieved product market fit. In other words, you know exactly what products and services you're selling, you know the price points that you're selling them at, you know the frequency at which your clients buy those, or the durations if they buy that they're buying, if they're recurring kind of professional services agreements or subscription kind of agreements, you know all the unit economics, you know like lifetime value, you know your cost of acquisition, you know your sales cycle length, all the things that give you confidence to be able to add more capital to the business and know that as you add more capital to the business that the wheels aren't going to fall off. So typically when a brand new company goes beyond founder-led sales to building out their hiring their first sales teams and scaling their sales teams and different regions and everything like that, they've moved from having product market fit to go-to-market fit. And the challenge is just maintaining that over an extended period of time. If you have a channel organization, meaning you have someone or one or more people in your organization that have the word channel or partnerships or something like that in their job title, then you'll also go through this exact same process to get to the point where you know exactly who your ideal partners are and how you define them, where they're located, your whole playbook that makes them successful, and how you onboard and retain those channel partners for the duration. And once you've achieved that, you'll have channel partner market fit. So you're with this, they ask her this question, you're at a stage where you have enough business maturity, growth maturity roadmap to know that you've answered a lot of those basic questions. So when it comes to marketing and selling to these data center clients, well, first place we're typically going to look is at your website, looking at the logos from the kinds of companies that have been successful with your data center infrastructure management. We're looking at testimonials, reviews, case studies. In addition to the public-facing clues about who your ideal clients are, we'll likely look into your CRM, your customer relationship management system. We'll talk to your your sales leaders, your client success or account management kind of leaders, and figure out who tends to be the most profitable, who has the most efficient sales process, who stays the longest, who onboards, who expands, who has the highest net promoter score. You may also want to get some information from your finance leader to find out who's got the best margins, who's got the best track record, where are you most efficient. And then many times your chief revenue officer, or even your CEO in a smaller company will set the strategic direction on the kind of clients that you want to be able to grow. So from knowing your history there, you'll typically define your ideal client profile, your ICP, and your ideal client profile will document things like geographically where they're located. Now, for a company that's providing actual infrastructure management where it needs to be in the facility, then geographic coverage for sure is an issue. If you're providing these services virtually, remotely, if you're providing more of a software kind of solution, you may be able to sell to a much wider geographic area beyond where you just happen to have marketers and sales professionals and services training kind of professionals in that particular local region. So in terms of defining how to market and sell to more data center clients, the first part of your ideal client profile is getting clear on geographically where they're located. Can you just sell to one country? Can you sell to multiple countries? Can you sell to an entire continent? Can you sell globally, or can you sell to multiple regions of the world that happen to speak a specific language where localization wouldn't be an issue? If you have more of a professional services firm, then yeah, having feet on the ground in that region becomes especially important. So in addition to geographic, we also want to nail down how big or small these particular companies are. The reason that this has bearing is regardless of whether you're in the DSIM software business, whether you're providing infrastructure management as a professional service, there are likely going to be some companies that are too small to afford your minimums. And there will likely be some companies that are so huge that they may have requirements that you just cannot deliver on today. You should know this over time based on what your minimum level of engagement is, your minimum purchase point, your minimum sign-up point is. Like, okay, so the company needs to have, I don't know, 50 employees or 200 employees or something like that to be able to afford you. And at the other extreme, a company with 10,000 or more employees may be too big. So you get your band there of what the employee headcount looks like on an ideal client. And that becomes super important for things that you do, like outbound prospecting, ads, especially if you use like a LinkedIn Campaign Manager or LinkedIn Sales Navigator or other kinds of prospecting databases. That also becomes super important for the drop-down lists on forums. It becomes super important for your filtering, your segmentation strategy, your qualification process that you use in your CRM, whether you decide to nurture, which teams it's assigned to, a whole host of related second degree impacts of how big or small a particular company is that someone works for. So there's geographic considerations, there's size considerations. There also tends to be industry considerations. In other words, when we think about like the business models or the niches or the industries that your prospects and clients are located in, when it comes to selling infrastructure management, and there's at a high level, there's two different kinds of data center clients, right? There's data center operators and there's end users, companies that have their own data centers, enterprise that are basically on their own data centers. So have you noticed that over time that your company tends to be more successful with data center operators or companies that own their own data centers? If it's not really a factor, then great, you can sell to both, and both of those would go in your ideal client profile. If you've noticed over time that data center operators make fantastic clients and companies that own their own data centers tend to be crappy clients, again, your results may vary. That, of course, needs to go in your ideal client profile. If you go really deep on enterprise end users that own their own data centers, and you found that certain industries were a better fit than others. Maybe for companies in telecommunications and financial services and healthcare, you've done really well, and in other industries, not so well. And some of this may be the intersection of some of your team's expertise, and maybe certain certifications or credentials, compliance kind of issues that you've invested in over time. But either way, if you know there's certain business models, certain industries that are a great fit, and you know there's others that are a terrible fit, make sure that's in your ideal client profile. So that's the ICP considerations, ideal client profile considerations. From there, I would encourage you to build out a target account list of your dream 100, your dream 500, your 1,000, your 5,000, whatever it is, number of accounts, number of companies that you think would be a fantastic fit for working with your firm on their data center infrastructure management needs. And for most companies, depending on your size, it's usually a couple hundred, it could be thousands, depending on your geographic coverage, your resources, all that stuff. So once you have your ideal client profile defined and you've built out a target account list, which is usually really integral for doing things like account-based marketing, ABM, or account-based selling, outbound prospecting, then we want to look beyond just the account level and drill into the people, the kinds of stakeholders that are within these companies that would typically be involved in a journey and a need for having data center infrastructure management, regardless, again, about whether we're talking about professional services or data center infrastructure management software. So the most important economic stakeholder that's going to weigh in that you've noticed over time tends to always show up pre-sales and post-purchase. That person we're going to call the primary buyer persona. Again, this is the person who has the biggest economic stake in the success or lack thereof of working with a company like yours. And you've noticed because you've looked at your 10, 20, 50 biggest or most recent clients, and you see that, oh yeah, they all tend to have the same kind of behavior. They're all struggling with these same kind of stressors and challenges. They're all working on these kinds of business goals. And we amalgamate all that together, and we call that your primary buyer persona. Over time, again, with dozens, hundreds of successful clients, you will likely have noticed some other kinds of stakeholders beyond that primary. The secondary one that also tends to show up but has a little bit less impact on the success of that engagement, we'll call that the secondary buyer persona. You may even have a tertiary, a third or fourth and most impactful buyer persona. Again, this is a category of stakeholder that is unified together because they have a common set of beliefs, a common set of business goals that they're working on individually as a team that rolls up into the company, and a common set of things that are driving them nuts when it comes to data center infrastructure, stressors, challenges, blockers, things that destroy their work-life balance, things that mess with their psychological safety, things that may cause them to have a family vacation that's interrupted, things that may send them to therapy, things that may cause them to go for antacids or coffee or whatever a lot more often than they should. But overall, it's just stuff that's driving them nuts when it comes to data center infrastructure management. And the better job you do of having a pulse on what those aggregate challenges and stressors are, the easier it is to have educational events, educational resources, messaging, basically everything that you're doing to communicate with the kind of prospect, the more likely it is that you're grabbing them by the virtual shirt collar as they scroll by and pulling them in because of extreme relevance and extreme value to helping that kind of individual understand how they can better do their job. That's the key part with all of this. This isn't about you. This isn't about your team. It's about being very client-centric, understanding how you can add value to the professional lives by teaching them how other people in similar jobs and similar kinds of companies in the same geographic region, roughly the size, same kind of industry, have navigated these kinds of issues and come out better on the other side. Or in other words, anything and everything that's directly or indirectly related to data center infrastructure management, that's a leading indicator that shows that sometime in the coming days, weeks, or months, that they're going to be in market, that they're going to be ready for a sales-related conversation with your company on something related to data center infrastructure management. And that's the challenge with all of this, is you don't know when it's going to go from it being researched to now being acted on or actioned on. And that's the reason why it's so important to take this approach of what I call early and often. What is early and often? Well, in the self-driven buyer's journey, where people are more sales allergic than ever, and there's typically a couple dozen touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, your goal should be to control as much of the surface area as possible between awareness to consideration and consideration to decision. And the way we do that is we really need to understand for each of those prioritized buyer personas, what are the topics, what are the themes, what are the goals, what are the challenges that they're struggling to figure out that are a leading indicator that they're going to need your kind of company's products and services in the coming weeks and coming months. Now, there's no guarantee that we're going to get the timing right, but if we're in there early and often, there's a really good chance that we're going to get to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate your category. If we do a really good job on this, there's a really good chance that they're also going to start to bring their coworkers along with them to your educational events. And when that happens, the real magic starts to play itself out. Because we know one of the most important roles of an account executive going forward in a self-driven buyer's journey is to be a fantastic project manager to support your internal champion in driving alignment across your internal champion's team and other relevant teams within the company. And when you're able to have multiple stakeholders from this company invest a significant amount of their learning and development, their professional development time, learning and growing with your subject matter experts, especially in this category, you are proactively driving alignment during the sales process. And the better job you would do with this early and often, and by often, what do I mean by often? Well, you figure out when you do your buyer persona research that there's 5 or 6 big goals, 5 or 6 big challenges that they're figuring out. So, 10 or 12 topics that are top of mind for this particular buyer persona. With those 10 or 12 topics, what should you do with them? That's 10 or 12 lunch and learns, 10 or 12 breakfast seminars, a 10 or 12 part webinar series. In other words, in there every single month. And again, the more value that your internal subject matter experts can provide to teach and educate and build trust with key people in these accounts, the more magical things start to happen with people bringing their coworkers, bringing their boss along with them. And you start to see many dominoes falling down in terms of getting on shortlist, staying on shortlist, proactively knocking competitors off a shortlist because they're just learning so much from you about this category. There's really no time or no need for them to look elsewhere for these kinds of professional development and learning and development kinds of experiences. So going forward in a hyper-competitive global marketplace where people are more self-driven, self-service than they've ever been in the past, especially among highly technical, highly cynical, skeptical IT facilities kinds of professionals, these educational events are incredibly important. Conferences can help with this to a certain degree if they line up really, really well with your ideal client profile and you're in a position where you could educate in building trust. It's really hard to do education and trust building if you only have 90 seconds of someone's attention on an expo floor, meaning the speaking is where it's all at. But in many ways, I think the big conferences, the big national and global conferences should be looked at as top of the funnel lead gen for getting people into your educational events funnel, your educational events program that helps them learn anything and everything that they need to help them better do their job when it comes to anything and everything related to data center infrastructure management for an individual like that in a particular company in a particular region of roughly that size. So yeah, going forward, your marketers, your sales professionals should look a lot more like teachers and consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors. Some of them may be even seen as thought leaders. And that's the key unlock with all of this for how a data center infrastructure management company can market and sell to data center clients, is stop marketing and selling and start educating and building trust. Because it's up to you. Either you're going to educate and build trust, or a company that you're competing against is going to educate and build trust. Do you want to be the one that's controlling the narrative? Do you want to be the one that's shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate anything and everything related to data center infrastructure management? Or do you want to leave that in the hands of a direct competitor or an indirect competitor or a non-business model competitor? Ultimately, the choice is yours, but the path forward in a world where we're just as addicted to our generative AI tools as we've been to social media, the path forward really, really comes down to helping your marketers, your sales professionals, your account managers get the heck out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box. And the way out of that vendor box for good is to educate and build trust. This is a company culture issues for a lot of companies that are very steeped in using a very old school traditional approach that they really haven't modified much since the 2010s. But rest assured, your buyers, your ideal clients, your buyer personas, they've changed their behaviors big time. So the question is, are you keeping up or are you living in the past? If you are a data center infrastructure management company wants to market and sell to data center clients, education and trust building is incredibly important. The only question is how soon you're willing to break from the past to make room for the current and make room for the future. Because in most scenarios, this isn't a future like that these changes are going to happen. The changes have already happened. Your prospects and clients are not going to wake up tomorrow and wish that, gee, can we go back to buying the way we did 10 or 20 years ago? This DoorDash thing and this Uber thing and this Amazon.com thing and this whole Netflix thing, it's really annoying. We should go back to renting videos and looking up phone numbers in a printed phone book and waiting to learn about things when a postcard comes in the mail. And gee, does anyone have a printed newspaper around anymore? I could really use catching up on the sports scores from yesterday by tying into a piece of paper that was printed 18 hours ago. Now, the digital transformation has steamrollered all of that. It would be incredibly backwards looking to think that your prospects and clients haven't kept up. But if you need that validation, for sure, do your buyer persona research, do your customer insight research, and you'll find out exactly what we're talking about here is that your prospects and clients are, for the most part, very digitally savvy. It'd be really hard for them to be internal champions of anything related to digital transformation if they were wishing that they could get trade in their iPhone or their Android for a BlackBerry, if they were hoping to put out a new fleet of fax machines to get rid of the fiber connections, because fiber is just too much fun. We'd rather go back to toner and thermal paper and things like that. So if you're living in the present and you understand what's truly going on and how much your prospects and clients are dramatically influenced by what they learn on their own, the goal is to be part of how they learn on their own by making it so worthwhile, so hyper relevant to who they are and what they're working on, that it is an irresistible offer to spend time with you and your client-facing team members, your internal subject matter experts, in a professional development and learning development context. So that's how I would approach how a data center infrastructure management company can market and sell to data center clients. If you have an idea for a topic or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching. So what do we have up next? What's our next question? How does a data center infrastructure and facility management company find the right leads? How does a data center infrastructure and facility management company find the right leads? So the challenge, again, with data center infrastructure is technologists and facility managers mean something completely different when they use the word infrastructure. For a technologist, cabling, connectivity, routers, switches are infrastructure. For a facilities person, a lot of times infrastructure could mean utility power and energy and a host of related issues that are external to the facility and how they come into the facility like that. So it's really, really important when you're talking about infrastructure to clarify your business model and the implications of how your business model works with finding its ideal clients and who the key personas are, who the key stakeholders are that you work with internally. So once you have that clarity in place of knowing both historically and presently the kinds of clients that have gotten the best value from working with your company that's focused on data center infrastructure and facility management, you'll be able to tighten up that focus into like a crisp one-page ideal client profile. So the infrastructure and facility management, for the most part, requires physical presence, regardless of whether you're providing some software technology solution or professional services or a combination of the two. Facility management, by definition, is usually outsourced services where you're providing services that are an extension of what that company is able to provide internally. And when you talk about like huge data center facilities being built with like minimal full-time employees, what that's not taking into account, and by the way, that's a big narrative that go-to-market sales and marketing professionals need to be able to address among community stakeholders, is you're taking all our utility power and you're taking all our water and you're taking all our land and you're causing all this community disruption and you're not even creating jobs. The reality is a lot of the jobs that are created by data center facilities are going to third-party channel partners. In other words, it's a whole ecosystem, both initially, like to the point of commissioning and beyond, like through the full life cycle operation of that facility over several months and over several years. So a company that's providing like data center infrastructure and facility management is definitely part of the long tail of jobs being created by a new data center facility that's commissioned, that's brought online, that don't necessarily show up in the payroll of the data center operator, right? So for finding the right leads, we need to really dial in who the best clients historically have been that you want to be able to clone, that you want to be able to replicate. And again, as you've often heard me talk about, like your website probably gives a lot of clues about this, and your logos and your testimonials and case studies and your CRM and your finance system should all give lots of clues about who your most profitable clients are, who generates the most revenue, who has the most efficient sales process, who has the best margins, the best unit economics, who fits best with your current product roadmap, with your near future product roadmap of where you're taking the company next. All of that should factor into having a really crisp one-page ideal client profile of geographically where these companies are located, how big or small these companies are. And the challenge with the big or small is everyone first and foremost wants to think of kilowatts and megawatts and square footage, square meters. The reality is, from a go-to-market perspective, from prospecting, from lead generation, from nurturing, from qualification, you'll almost always need to standardize on headcount, on number of employees that a particular company has as part of that ideal client profile and part of executing your go-to-market and demand generation. So there's geographic considerations, because for the most part, you're going to need to have team members, or at least contractors, that are local to that particular facility, so you can service and provide those facility management infrastructure kind of services on an ongoing basis. There's size considerations. How big do they need to be to afford your minimum entry point? And at the other extreme, if they're so large, could they overwhelm your company's ability to service them today? So yeah, just be self-aware on that, on what's so small that they can't afford you, and what's so large that it's really not a fit, because you're really may not be in a position to serve a Fortune 500 company or a Fortune 1000 company right now with tens of thousands of employees relative to your company size, unless you happen to be relatively large as well and have those kind of capabilities. So there's size considerations, there's geographic considerations, and then there's business model or industry considerations. Like, are you especially good at providing these services for like operators, and even within operators, maybe you have strong talents and you've done really well with edge and co-location, but you don't really find hyperscale engagements profitable, or wholesale data center providers, wholesale data center developers, especially profitable. That's important to know. Maybe you work with end users, but you've only had end users who own their operators, who own their own data centers in financial services and healthcare, and you've gotten really good at financial services and healthcare, but it's not particularly profitable to work with clients outside of that for whatever reason. Again, those industry niches, those business model considerations should for sure go in your ideal client profile, because they'll have an enormous bearing on how you build out your target account list, on how you segment up your buyer personas, your personalization strategy for resonating and providing services that make the most sense for particular specific kinds of clients. And it will also factor largely into your product strategy, your service strategy decisions, whether you have a chief product officer, VP of product management, or something like that, or there's just someone else in your company whose job it is to figure out what your marketplace needs and how you're going to deliver on those needs profitably as a business going forward. So with all of that in mind, that'll help you get your ideal client profile in good shape. That'll help you get your target account list in good shape, of anywhere from a couple dozen, couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand companies if you're national or global. And once you've defined at the company level, you'll have the individual stakeholders within those companies, how you segment out your primary and secondary, potentially your tertiary buyer personas, the individual stakeholders, and what's top of mind for each of those segments, what their biggest goals and challenges are when it comes to anything and everything related to data center infrastructure and facility management. With smaller companies, it's very likely that you'll have a single point of contact or a single team that handles both infrastructure and facility management kind of needs. In huge enterprises and huge data center operators, it may be multiple stakeholders that roll up to having those kinds of needs. And it's possible that you provide infrastructure for certain kind of clients and facility management services for other clients. And every once in a while, you provide both to similar kinds of clients. Again, you getting your company to product market fit and go to market fit where you know exactly the products and services they purchase from you and the frequency, how often they purchase or how long these agreements tend to be and the price points. All of that is incredibly important and it's going to be shaped quite a bit depending on your company size and your capabilities and their company size and their needs. And being able to generate and sustain that strong demand is what defines that you have product market fit. Being able to scale your sales organization profitably, knowing that you have a very predictable playbook and hiring and onboarding and ramp time. And you know that, okay, for every account executive or sales development rep that we hire, they have a ramp time of 3.7 months and the sales cycle is 4.1 months. And we know when we have those two things together that we expect a newly hired rep to be marginally productive, hitting partial quota at like month 8 and to be fully at quota by month 12 or 16 or whatever it is. All of those things of being able to answer those questions helps you learn and ensure that as you deploy additional capital, as you continue to grow, that your clients are getting a similar kind of experience, your prospects are getting a similar kind of experience, and you're attracting and growing and nurturing and retaining the right kinds of clients for infrastructure and facility management. So yeah, finding the right leads isn't just about finding them, it's motivating those leads to want to spend a significant amount of time with your client-facing team members. That's the challenge with all of this, because yeah, it's I don't want to say it's easy or trivial, but it's very, very different having a list of potential clients or a list of potential leads versus motivating those leads to want to spend enough time with your client-facing team members where they have a chance to truly educate and build trust with those prospects and future clients about anything and everything that's related to data center infrastructure and facility management. And in order to motivate those folks to want to spend significant amounts of time with your client-facing team members, you got to provide value. You have to understand what's going on in their world, their biggest goals, their biggest challenges, and how you can help them do their job better. It's not about you selling them infrastructure and facility management. It's about the what's in it for me from the perspective of your primary and your secondary and potentially your tertiary buyer persona. And the better job you do with that, the more likely it is that they're motivated to want to spend a significant amount of their professional development, their learning and development time learning and growing with your internal subject matter experts. And it doesn't always have to be your internal subject matter experts. If you also have contractors that you work with, if you have vendor subject matter experts, if you have channel partners that you can bring in to supplement your educational events program, in addition to your internal subject matter experts, and you're just moderating panels and hosting events like that, that's awesome as well. The whole idea is early and often. We want to understand what are the leading indicators that your ideal clients, that your prioritized buyer personas are going to be in market for data center infrastructure and facility management in the coming weeks and in the coming months. And we need to understand enough of those big goals and challenges that we have a fantastic educational events program in person, online, on demand, all of the above, that motivates key people from those accounts to want to spend significant amount of their time over the course of the year learning from your experts about how they can do their job better and how they can address their biggest challenges when it comes to data center infrastructure and facility management. And of course, over time, you will get to school those folks on your approaches, on your best practices, on your methodologies, indoctrinate them to a certain degree, but most of all, you're educating and building trust. You're giving them the framework to invite their peers, their coworkers, their boss, other members of the decision committee, along with them to continue learning from your subject matter experts. So again, the goal with all of this is to make your lead generation, to make your lead nurturing heavily steeped in the idea of getting you out of the vendor box and educating and building trust with your most important ideal prospects and ideal future clients. So it's not just about finding the right leads, it's motivating those leads, incentivizing those leads to want to spend a significant amount of time. There's a lot of people that think that they can take shortcuts with literally dumping money in their lap, bribing them with lavish sports experiences and all kinds of crazy swag and everything. These are educated prospects and clients. Many of them have master's degrees, PhDs. They're sales allergic, to say the least. So we need to figure out a way to earn our way in early and often in a context so we're actually adding value, that they don't feel like they're being played or that they're being manipulated, that you genuinely want to help them and their team do better at understanding how others just like them in similar kinds of companies are addressing their biggest professional challenges when it comes to infrastructure and facility management. So that's the overall approach that I would use for how a data center infrastructure and facility management company can find the right leads. A couple more questions that we're going to be addressing in this week's data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show. But before we do that, we're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're tuned into Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, our weekly live Q&A show where I addressed a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators, technology and facilities companies, construction, real estate and investment companies, and outsourced sales and marketing companies in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. If you've been getting good value so far from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for future shows. So what do we have up next? Our next question this week is all about commissioning, which is a really important part of the data center facilities part of the data center ecosystem. So the question in particular is how a data center commissioning company can avoid commoditization, specifically commoditization around pre-design, design, construction, and turnover. So how does a company that is principally in the business of providing data center commissioning, helping brand new facilities come on, be tested and validated to be ready to come online, how do they differentiate, how do they stand out from the crowd to avoid having to compete on price, to avoid commoditization in these four categories: in pre-design, design, construction, and turnover commoditization? That is a fantastic question. It's interesting, in the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast that I host, we've actually started to have some subject matter experts on in recent episodes who deal specifically with data center commissioning. And we're going to continue to build out in these areas because as the data center ecosystem continues to go through periods of massive growth with bigger facilities, with more power than ever before, there's going to continue to be more need, more demand for innovation among data center commissioning companies in terms of not only the best practices for how the commissioning work is actually done, but innovation in terms of how they go to market. And it's super interesting that the person that's asking this question is mentioning that despite the crazy amounts of demand that's out there for new data centers coming online and selling commissioning professional services, that they're still facing commoditization, meaning that they feel like they're getting backed into a corner and being forced to compete on price and RFPs, requests for proposals, requests for quotes, and they're not really having a chance to shape their company's future and brand going forward in any of these 4 categories: pre-design, in other words, before the data center is designed, the design phase, the construction phase, and the turnover phase, where it's turned over from the general contractor to either the owner operator or the end user kind of client. So one of the most important factors to control the narrative and to control your brand and to avoid this commoditization in the first place, I think a lot of it is getting really dialed into your place in the universe where your company has done best. And this is hard for smaller companies. It's hard for global companies too. I interviewed a commissioning expert from Bureau Veritas, which is, I don't know if it's the largest, but certainly one of the largest global data center commissioning companies. So how do you think about standing out from the crowd and truly differentiating? I think a lot of it is understanding where you can really excel and where you've excelled historically, and leaning into your strengths and not over-investing in your weaknesses until you're really ready to attack those. So, for example, commissioning is definitely one of those categories where proximity is incredibly important. And that proximity can be achieved because you already have offices and employees in that region, or you're willing to have those folks travel to that region for an extended period of time during these various phases. So definitely there's a geographic part of doing this well. There's a company size part of doing this well. In other words, all different kinds of data centers need, data center operators need commissioning. Now, are you primed to do really, really well with big, massive global data center operators commissioning needs? Like, are you going after data center operators as big as like Digital Realty or Equinix or NTT Global Data Centers or Switch or something like that? Or do you tend to do much better with mid-sized data center operators? Or maybe you only do well with small, closely held data center operators where you have a direct relationship with a CEO. You know, a data center operator that has 50 employees or 100 or 200 employees with a handful or two, a couple of handfuls of facilities at the most. So yeah, figure out where you've done best, where you think you continue to do best, both with serving their needs and being able to market and sell and service profitably, both in terms of where they're located and size. And then I think the second part of that, as opposed to getting extreme self-awareness around your ideal client profile, is being seen as the go-to resource on anything and everything having to do with the full life cycle of commissioning. Because once you really understand who the ideal clients are, you can start to segment within those ideal clients to understand the different kinds of stakeholders that you work with on a regular basis. And in really large hyperscale kind of environments or enterprise environments, you're almost certainly working with someone that has the word commissioning or something similar in their job title or job function. As you get to mid-sized companies and smaller companies, you start to see a lot of job functions roll up into one, people wearing lots of different hats. So for sure, getting self-awareness about that ideal client and how you're segmenting them is super, super important. I think it's also equally important to understand at these engagements, who's the internal champion, who's the economic, who's the financial decision maker, and understanding these 2 or 3 different kinds of people that are involved in all or nearly all of your engagements and what's going on in their world. Not just what's going on in their world to the extent of all the notes that you have in your CRM system of all the emails and LinkedIn messages and phone calls and Zoom meetings and in-person meetings that have happened. That's important as well. But I'd encourage you to go even deeper, because there's a really good chance before someone on your business development side had the very first conversation with a prospect or a client that there was a whole bunch of things that were leading indicators that that person was going to need services from your company in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And to the extent that you're able to get insights about what those big topics are, what those big goals are, what those big challenges are, they're a leading indicator that it's going to, that there's going to be a conversation like the kind of initial first conversation that you had, the better job you're going to do at being able to get in early and often. And early and often is incredibly important to having better mind share with that individual. In other words, getting that individual to be motivated to want to spend more time with your company's client-facing team members, with your company's subject matter experts. In other words, we need to intercept them potentially months, weeks, at least days, usually weeks or months, before they're to the point where they're going to be ready to make a purchase decision about data center commissioning. If we're only meeting people when they're just about ready to buy, it's too late. Really way, way too late. In other words, in the world we live in now, where like 83% of a buyer's journey is over before you get to meet a prospect, that means that if you didn't get a chance to shape their criteria, they're 83% of the way of 83% of their mind is already made up. In other words, you only have a chance to change the criteria that they use. The final 17%, it really doesn't give you much of an opportunity at all, because they've already largely made up their mind, because someone else got in there early and someone else stayed in there often and shaped the criteria that they were going to use to evaluate the full life cycle of these kinds of projects, from pre-design to design to construction to turnover. So getting a lot more deliberate about the kind of companies that you're targeting, and by definition, having an ideal client profile and a target account list of, say, 100 companies or 500 companies that really matter, helps to sharpen your focus tremendously. And then understanding who those stakeholders are within the company. We need to get X-ray vision into what's going on in their world to really understand what they're trying to achieve professionally, both as an individual, as part of a team, as part of their company, that directly impacts this big data center development project, this big data center construction project that's going to need commissioning. And the better job we do at understanding that customer insight and understanding that buyer persona, the most likely it is that we're going to expose a dozen or so different kinds of goals and struggles that they're dealing with that are directly or indirectly related to this big, massive data center development project that's going to need commissioning. And once we have these insights, our goal is to be a fantastic resource, fantastic educational resource. We're publishing these super helpful downloadable planning guides and tools and podcasts and webinars and videos and potentially trainings and certifications, and most of all, educational events where we have a chance to educate and build trust with one or more stakeholders from this particular company. And when this is done right, a lot of what this looks like on a tactical basis is, for example, let's say with our primary and our secondary buyer persona, the two different kinds of really important stakeholders for this kind of engagement, we uncover that each of them has like 10 or 12 different goals and challenges that they're navigating currently that are related to your category. So those 10 or 12 goals and challenges, that's your events calendar. And it doesn't matter about whether we're talking about a monthly webinar series, 10 or 12 parts over the next 10 or 12 months, whether we're talking about a monthly breakfast seminar, or a monthly lunch and learn with 10 or 12 installments once a month over the next 10 or 12 months, or both, or all of the above. Or some people attend live, you record these, make these available on demand, you repurpose them into all the different formats, long form, short form, text, image, emails, social posts, carousels, whatever is necessary to get your content and get your value in front of the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So we get you out of the vendor box. So we get you out of commoditization. So you have a chance to differentiate throughout the full journey. And the only way that we're going to get you surface area in that full journey is to get you out of the vendor box. They can't see you as an account executive or a business developer or an account manager or a marketer anymore. They need to see you either individually or as part of a team that's providing this amazingly helpful set of educational events experiences that makes them want to spend a lot of their learning and development and professional development time with you and your client-facing team members, learning and growing with you. And when you do this well, they'll bring their peers, they'll bring their boss, you'll get to meet the full decision committee. And most of all, you will be proactively driving alignment and shaping the criteria that they use to navigate this whole lengthy journey of pre-design, design, construction, and turnover weeks or months before they're ready to make a purchase decision. Matter of fact, if you're customer insight and your buyer persona research aligns with the idea that there are these 4 phases that your primary buyer persona cares most about, you just found your first 4 modules that you need to cover in your educational training kinds of events for this particular. And again, do your own customer insight research to find what the 4 topics are, the 10 topics are, the 12 topics are. But again, pre-design 101 best practices, design best practices for data center operators in the Midwest United States or in Northern England or Singapore, wherever you're providing this kind of training and development experience. And the cool part is, this may sound like a lot of work, but relative to the expense of flying your entire team to national and global conferences, this is not an expensive endeavor. It really isn't. If you already have a target account list, if you already have email marketing, if you already have account managers, account executives, sales developers, this can be as simple as running these programs on a webinar program. If your prospects and clients are in close enough proximity to your office, and you have a nice conference room or a classroom that seats 10, 15, 20 people, the first week of the month, host your primary buyer persona. The third week of the month, host your secondary buyer persona. Invite them in, put out a little breakfast, put out a little lunch, give them a little bit of time to network, teach them some really cool stuff that can help them do their jobs better, answer some questions. If there's some things that you want to take them on a tour to show them, or you want to show them some video of some sites and some different projects to help them better understand what to look for. Like, the whole idea is to provide so much value that your ideal clients, that your primary or secondary buyer personas, are motivated to invest a lot of their time learning and growing with you. And when you do this well, and you have multiple stakeholders from the same company, not only gets you on the short list and keeps you on the short list, but you'll find that this kind of approach knocks your competition off of the short list. So right now, for this kind of company that's struggling with this kind of commoditization, more than likely, they're either not doing this or they're doing a really lousy job of executing this kind of playbook. Because if they were, you would not be struggling with commoditization. You would be truly differentiating and getting in there early and often with the right people, in the right places, at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So the most important stakeholders in these companies see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center commissioning throughout the full cycle, throughout pre-design, design, construction, and turnover. And the better job you do at that, the more you're going to educate and build trust, the more you're going to stack the decks in your favor. And by the time they get to a sales-related conversation, everything is already well aligned. You've already built up the know, like, and trust. And for sure, you've gotten out of the commodity broker, struggling price competition kind of box. So that's my general playbook, general strategy on how a data center commissioning company can avoid pre-design, design, construction, and turnover commoditization. If you're getting good value, if you're enjoying this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. Okay, what do we have up next? This is a channel partner kind of question. Love those as well. How does a global data center solutions provider improve its lead generation? How does a global data center solution provider improve its lead generation? That is a fantastic question. And it brings up a couple of issues. For starters, data center solution providers are a business model that's very closely, it's been around for decades, and it's very closely related to other kinds of channel partners in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, critical facilities ecosystem. In other words, like the first cousins of a solution provider might be like an integrator, like a network or a system integrator, a managed service provider, an MSP, master agent, or something like that. And typically a solution provider is working with products and services from multiple companies and bringing it all together into one cohesive solution. And as the data center ecosystem digital infrastructure and critical facilities gets a lot more complicated. It's more important than ever for your clients to be able to have that single point of contact, that single point of accountability. They don't want to hear that it's not working because it's someone else's fault. That's why they're hiring your company to provide that single solution. And increasingly, we're even hearing from large players in this, large companies, leaders in this space, companies as big as like Vertiv and Eaton and Schneider and Legrand, that their clients are demanding the single point of contact, the single solution that their sales team even gets involved pre and post and be able to make happen. And in many cases, they're either taking the lead on bringing the solution together, on orchestrating things and bringing you in as an integrated part where they're taking responsibility for everything, or you're providing a white label solution as like a subcontractor to a big company like that. But there's a huge need for companies to be able to have the assurance in the ever increasing, complicated, fast growing world of data centers that the single point of contact, that the single solution stitches and makes everything work together. So a solution provider by definition is usually working with a couple of different companies. It's very unlikely that a solution provider bets its entire business model on one particular company. When you do have that case, they're usually like called more of a like manufacturer's rep, but even manufacturers reps and distributors usually have a line card that has a couple of different companies. But usually what differentiates the solution providers, they're primarily selling products which may or may not have a great margin, but they're selling services that are a really important part of that, usually that have significantly better margins. Their clients are leaning on them to provide help, significant amounts of help, both pre and post sales. A lot of times they're leaning on the clients to be much closer to them than a large company would be, like boots on the ground. They're kind of like an extension of their business, extension of their capabilities, and advocating for them with a larger vendor. So the challenge with this kind of business model is it can work really well locally. It can work really well regionally, and it can work really well globally. However, the big however with all of this is having the resources to be able to potentially provide these kinds of services in a dozen different markets globally, and what that actually means in terms of capital, staffing, go-to-market strategy, localization, understanding cultural issues with both recruiting and retaining employees, recruiting and retaining channel partners, solution providers, and being able to grow a successful, profitable, sustainable go-to-market playbook, sales and marketing playbook in each of these regions. Global by definition almost always means that you're dealing with lots of different time zones. You're dealing with lots of different cultural issues. You're probably multilingual at that point. And then for sure that impacts your lead generation. The challenge too is different markets have different ways of behaving. Like I mentioned Eaton, Schneider, Legrand, and Vertiv, of some companies that have definitely worked through this kind of issue. I interviewed Rich Farrell from Eaton a couple of months back, who'd been heading up the data center division for Eaton in Asia Pacific, and was in the process of moving to Dubai to basically do the same thing in the Middle East. And we talked about the idea of established markets, mature markets, and kind of emerging markets, and how they have very different needs. And I think it's a great reminder that like the playbook that you might have figured out for growing a data center solution provider business that works really well in the United States may need significant amounts of tweaking aside from just translation to work well in South America. It's not like you can just translate your content and translate your playbook into Spanish and Portuguese and you're good to go. No, each of these markets, regardless of whether we're talking about the Americas, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, Pacific, each has different idiosyncrasies, each has different habits, each have different ecosystems. And even within the region, there's many times different kinds of playbooks that need to be executed for growing a business successfully. So the challenge is it's not just translation, it's not just localization, it's basically understanding how to build a whole business in that area. And the reason that that's super important when we're talking about lead generation, it's leads by themselves aren't particularly useful if they don't convert, if a percentage of those don't convert to opportunities. And sales opportunities are not especially useful if a percentage of those don't convert to paying clients. And paying clients aren't especially useful if they don't convert into repeat clients and sources of future growth. So everything needs to be looked at as one big holistic need for business growth and go-to-market strategy. In terms of improving lead generation, the one thing that I would caution you is in the same way that global channel partners and global solution providers isn't just a matter of localization and translation. It's a matter of understanding what's unique about that particular region, what's unique about those kinds of companies, essentially a different ideal client profile, a different target account list, a different set of buyer personas for each region. It's also equally important to recognize that different team members use the word lead differently. Like a marketer may look at a lead as someone that converts on a landing page to subscribe to a newsletter or download an ebook or a special report. That's a lead. For an account executive, they don't think of that as a lead. They think of that as someone that wanted a piece of premium content that may have zero interest in learning more about your company's global data center solutions. An account executive is excited about a person from a qualified account that is a good fit and is showing strong signs of interest in having a conversation about potentially engaging your company for some kind of global or regional or local kinds of data center solutions needs. So recognize that in addition to there being challenges around global implementation, there's also challenges with different team members using the word lead differently. And then the third part of that is intentional lead generation. What does intentional lead generation means is that we need to recognize that most prospects and most clients, regardless of the region of the world in which you're located in, one common theme is sales allergy. In other words, people, especially highly technical IT and facilities and entrepreneurial kind of business owners, are doing so much more research on their own before they're ready for a conversation with someone from your sales team, so much more than they ever have in the past. This is what I call the sales allergy. Like this world we live in now, where most prospects, most future clients want to be almost to the point that they're ready to buy, learning on their own before they're ready to talk with you. And this changes the nature of what it means to actually get a lead. So in order for us to get a lead, we need to get in early and often. And this is a big culture challenge for a lot of companies because historically, early and middle stage conversations, account executives would punt to marketing. They'd say, that's a marketing job, let them deal with that. And the problem with that approach is in order for an account executive and a sales developer, business developer to get out of the vendor box, they need to be seen more like a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, and a subject matter expert. And they can't do that if they're not building a strong company and professional brand. And in order to build a strong professional brand, they need to be out there early and often in front of the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context so they can get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box. So this is a big culture change. This requires sales professionals to be prepared to come in much earlier in the buyer journey than they ever have historically in their career. And along the same lines, marketers need to be prepared to go much deeper into the buyer's journey than they typically have in their career. Because one of the biggest mistakes a lot of companies make across the board in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities is they assume that marketing is primarily a top of the funnel, middle of the funnel function. And once leads are handed off, everything's fine. No, the reality is in a self-driven world, sales is not the only function in a company that needs great content marketing and needs great events. Your account managers need the exact same thing. Your product managers need the exact same thing. Your channel partner organization needs the exact same thing. Your HR function needs the exact same thing. Great content, great events. So with that in mind, you start to realize that bearing marketing as a sales support function may be good for dealing with immediate type of things, but really neglects a lot of long-term business growth, customer experience, prospect experience kinds of challenges. So the big three challenges that I think that you need to really address to improve your lead generation for this kind of business is recognizing that global is not just about localization and translation. It's about understanding the unique idiosyncrasies of these marketplaces, better defining the ideal client profile, better sharpening the target account list, better sharpening those buyer personas, and building a strong, proactive go-to-market playbook that's focused on educating and building trust with the prioritized buyer personas. The second part of that is recognizing that different people on your team are going to use the word lead to mean very different things. So get on the same page about life cycle stages and what a lead actually looks like and how you're going to fund and resource and make these kinds of investments. Because a lot of times when the terms aren't used, not only are there disagreements and fights and finger pointing, but a lot of times you're very much under resourcing the economic value of what those mean. And then third, recognize that your buyers don't want to spend a ton of time with salespeople anymore. They don't want to spend a ton of time with vendors anymore, but they do still need to learn. So the way to earn your way in early and often is to get out of that vendor box and don't be seen as a solution provider vendor, but instead be seen as someone that's prepared to help them tremendously, help these ideal clients, these ideal buyer personas tremendously learn and grow individually as a team, as a company. So being involved early and often to educate and build trust. So that's what I would recommend for how a global data center solutions provider can improve their lead generation. That brings us to our final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. And if you're getting good value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. Okay, what's our final question? Final one is for a specialized class of data center operator, hyperscalers. How does a hyperscale data center build a memorable brand in a saturated market? How do we create a memorable hyperscale data center brand in a saturated market? So saturated markets are good and bad. Saturated markets mean that the market is very well educated about hyperscale. There's huge opportunities. There's massive deals that have happened, and to a certain degree will still continue to happen. But it means it's a mature, saturated market, meaning that for a new entrant to break through the noise, it's going to be way more challenging than it would have been a couple of years ago. That's the bad news. The good news is a lot of your ability to invest aggressively in growth and go to market and educating and building trust is a function of your unit economics, your deal sizes. In other words, let's take a real simple example. A co-location operator that's selling $800 a month co-location or your local currency equivalent, where a client is worth roughly $10,000 a year in annual recurring revenue or your local currency equivalent, there's only so much marketing and sales investment that can happen for a co-location operator to be profitable on that $30,000 lifetime value client or your local currency equivalent. Again, could you invest 20% in that, 30% in that? Probably. This is where channel partnerships become interesting. This is where on even smaller deals where you get from like $800 a month colo to $200 a month colo, this is where you start to see it's inside sales doesn't work anymore, and self-sign-up, self-onboarding, like that looks a lot more like e-commerce, that looks a lot more like buying hosting or public cloud, becomes more in favor. Hyperscale is the other extreme. You really don't ever hear about people selling small hyperscale deals. Hyperscale by definition is hyperscale, big scale. So because of that, it's very common to find sales teams that are working on much more complex deals with huge amounts of potential revenue at stake. Usually those are 6, 7 figure, sometimes even more than 7 figure deals. They can have a much longer sales cycle. There's a lot more stakeholders involved. The criteria that the hyperscale buyers are using is usually a lot more demanding than the criteria that an SMB, a smaller mid-sized business or mid-market kind of business would use for purchasing co-location. But the deal sizes are huge. So because of that, if you're using the same kind of thinking of 10, 20, 30%, whatever it is, for funding marketing, sales, go-to-market growth, there's a lot of things that open up to you that wouldn't have been available to you in the past just because the unit economics are so massive. I've been saying for quite some time, going back for a few years now, that enterprise teams that are selling hyperscale deals that are 7-figure plus deals or multi 6-figure deals, most of those teams would benefit tremendously from each of those teams having their own little micro media brand that is specifically raining massively helpful educational content and massively helpful educational events on top of their small target account list. And again, that's the key thing with all of this, is that they're huge deals, but when you figure out your ideal client profile and you figure out how many potential hyperscale buyers there are for a particular facility that you're buying, you're usually talking about a couple of handfuls or a couple of dozen companies. Meaning that the great part is you don't have a particularly wide net that you need to cast and you have massive resources, but there's so much more at stake. And if you think about like the $10,000 a year or your local currency equivalent co-location deal, you may be good with like 2 different buyer personas, segmenting into your primary and your secondary kind of person that's involved pre and post sales and educating and building trust with those 2 different kinds of people. Hyperscale, you could have 5 or 10 different kinds of stakeholders that are involved. Now, the non-intuitive hyperscale stakeholders that no one thinks about are the community stakeholders that are blocking your facility from ever wanting to be built in the first place. So, you have your community stakeholders, 3 or 4 personas there. You have your elected officials, regulators, utility companies, activists. That's before you get anywhere near your economic stakeholders at hyperscalers that would potentially buy, or enterprises that would potentially buy hyperscale kinds of capacity. So yeah, just a lot more different kinds of people involved, much bigger decision committees, much more coordination, much more alignment that needs to be driven by, for a lot, and this has started in SaaS a couple of years ago, but it's certainly percolated to infrastructure as a service and hyperscale. The future of being an enterprise account executive looks a lot more like being a project manager whose primary function it is to support your internal champion, to help your internal champion drive alignment across their team and other relevant teams within their company. That's a huge, huge part of your job going forward. And that's the reason why, to the extent that you can get in there early and often in an educational, trusted advisor kind of context, long before they're ready for a sales kind of conversation, it is a huge, huge win on your part. How do you get in there early and often? The micro media company for those couple dozen companies, for those couple dozen targeted accounts. And by micro media, all of your blogging strategy, all your podcasting strategy, certainly your websites, certainly your downloadable premium content, for sure, your webinar strategy, for sure, your educational event strategy is largely about hyper-focusing on these couple dozen companies and the handful or 2 of different kinds of personalities, personas that have different goals and different challenges, different struggles that they're working through when it comes to anything and everything for finding the right kind of digital infrastructure partner to help them with their hyperscale data center needs. And if you talk to the CTO like you would talk to a CFO, it's not going to resonate. If you talk to the network operations center leader the same way you would talk to an ESG leader, environmental social governance leader, it's not going to resonate. So it's super important to know who the people are and be able to rank them and prioritize them based on the amount of pull, economic pull that they have in these large deals. And then make sure that you've thought through about what's top of mind for each of them. And in many cases, it's well worth having interview-based podcast content. It's well worth having webinar series. It's well worth having educational event series that educate and build trust, one segment at a time. Don't be lazy. Don't try to throw them all together. Focus on what an infrastructure executive needs to know at this mid-market financial services company, because this is what the playbook looks like for other infrastructure executives at mid-market financial services companies who are working through these exact same 5 or 6 goals, these exact same 5 or 6 challenges. And over time, If you're struggling to figure out who is actually on these decision committees, your educational events will in many cases help to expose that, because as you're hosting these amazingly helpful learning and development, professional development experiences, and you say to each person that registers, we know when it comes to cybersecurity, compliance, efficiency, utility costs, whatever, we know it takes a village. We know it's truly a team effort. So with that in mind, you also benefit from attending. And when you see that they've forwarded it to their coworkers and they followed your lead and recommendations, and you start to see a handful of people registered from the same company, you start to understand who some of the other stakeholders are, way more than you can learn from just Sales Navigator, or way more than you can learn from just some of these conversations. And with any luck, a significant amount of people that register for your free events actually attend, and you learn even more with your interactions that you have from them, and their polls and surveys and Q&A and tours and whatever else you're doing to deepen the relationship. And over time, when you get enough people from the same account attending, one of them pulls you aside and said, "This is fantastic. We have like an all hands meeting next Friday where our whole IT team is going to be together, 35 of us or whatever it is. Can you come in and talk about this for like half hour, 40 minutes and give some highlight reel and answer some questions?" We're like, yeah, this is where it really, really starts to work. So that the challenge is, in a saturated market, the good news is there's a ton of money. There's a ton of financial investments that have already happened for hyperscale data center capacity. The bad news is the incumbents are really, really entrenched. So it becomes easier over time for them and harder for anyone that's new. The good news for anyone that's new, however, is your unit economics are so outrageously large that the playbook that I just described, that's sometimes out of reach when you're selling commoditized co-location, is very well within reach financially for selling these big hyperscale deals. And in fact, if you're already spending multiple 6 figures, 7 figures, maybe more on going to big national and global conferences, just figure out like what the bottom 20% of those were last year. What's the real long shot needle in a haystack where you pull up their media kit and you look at your ICP and it's not even remotely close? Just get rid of the bottom 20% from last year and you found 100, 200,000, whatever it is, the couple of people that you need to put into headcount to make this a reality. Because I can assure you that if you can get multiple stakeholders from these target companies to spend time with your client-facing team members in an education and trust-building professional development context, game changer. Yeah, there's still going to be some of you that said, but what about the cabana party? What about the golf tournament? What about taking them to a baseball game or a football game? Like, that stuff certainly has its place, but how much education and trust building is going on in those contexts? The name of the game for sales allergic IT professionals, financial executives, C-level executives, board members, whoever else is involved in these conversations, is being able to educate and build trust, help them do their job better at the intersection of their biggest goals and their challenges, and how that relates to your company's expertise in anything and everything having to do with hyperscale that, again, aligns with what you discover during that buyer persona, during that customer insight research. So given that building a brand is now about so much more than your hexadecimal colors and your logos and your fonts, your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room. It is incredibly important to educate and build trust with all of the most important stakeholders in these enterprise environments that are going to be buyers of hyperscale data center infrastructure in the coming weeks and in the coming months. If you do this well, you have a massive, massive opportunity to get on the short list, stay on the short list, and really shape the narrative. If you bury your head in the sand and continue to sell like it's still 10, 20 years ago, a very old-fashioned traditional playbook, you're almost certainly going to find that your competition, direct competitors, indirect competitors, non-business model competitors, some of them are getting in early and often. And those are the ones that are shaping the criteria that your prospects and clients are using to build their playbook for how they're going to ultimately make their hyperscale digital infrastructure decisions. So ultimately, the choice is yours. If you want to get out of the vendor box, if you want to stay out of the vendor box, if you want to aggressively grow this kind of hyperscale business, think about investing in growing a micro media engine that powers your lead generation, that powers your lead nurturing, and massively, massively motivates a significant amount of the decision committee in these target accounts to want to spend a lot of time learning and growing with your team members. So that's how I would create a memorable hyperscale data center brand in a saturated marketplace. And that is our final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic or a challenge or a question that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you like to watch on, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for upcoming episodes. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up, you can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you would like to be, make sure in the connection invitation that you mention that you have watched, that you're a fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. If you're a regular user of LinkedIn, you know why including that cover note is so incredibly important. We're so glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and wish you, your team, and your company tremendous success in growing your presence and your impact in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.